Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be speaking about how to talk to kids about sexual harassment. I'm Randi Pochtar. I'm a psychologist here at the Child Study Center.
I'm Christina Laitner. I'm a psychologist over at Bellevue Hospital Center. Thank you so much for joining us, and we just wanted to let you know that you can submit questions at any time today by typing them into the questions pane of the control panel that's on the right side of your screen, and we'll answer the questions at the end of our presentation.
So today we're going to be talking about a few different things. One is a general understanding of what sexual harassment is, what this term means. I think it's a term a lot of us have been hearing pretty often recently. We're going to talk about things to consider in terms of the frequency at which some of this media is being viewed in your home, some strategies for talking to your kids and teens about this topic, and some strategies related to educating your kids about safety in terms of how to keep themselves safe and respect in relationships, and how this relates to this area of sexual harassment. So to give a definition of what sexual harassment is, we use the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's definition, and that is that it's unlawful to harass a person because of that person's sex. Harassment can include sexual harassment or unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature. And the reason we bring up this definition is really to be thinking about, what are your kids thinking about when they hear this term? I think one thing we were talking a little bit about is that the media may be using this interchangeably with something like sexual assault. And we just want to be mindful of that when your kids are using this term or the term sexual assault, that you know what they mean when they're saying it. So that could just be clarifying when you use that word. I'm wondering what you're thinking about or what you're imagining that looks like. So just being mindful of knowing what your kids are talking about when they're using these terms or when you're using these terms. So in terms of media coverage of generally distressing events, the media can be a really important arena in terms of learning about and understanding current events. And we certainly agree that it can be important for children and teens to understand the current events, what's going on in the world, and to, in ways, for some kids, depending on age, and we'll talk more about that, be a part of this national conversation. One thing that we just want to be mindful of when it comes to viewing distressing things on the news or in the media is how much and how intense some of these stories are being viewed by kids. We know from previous research on things like the viewing of 9/11 and other traumatic and distressing events, the repetition of images and stories and excessive exposure to upsetting events can lead to sometimes confusion. Why is this happening so often? And increased anxiety in some kids and teens. I think we want to note, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, particularly for any child or teen who has their own history of either a sexual or other trauma, this may be particularly pertinent to them. And I
was also just going to say, thinking about the term media, right? This can be in so many different forms in our home, right? It's not just watching the news anymore, right? It's your smartphone, your laptop, it's all over the place.
Every social media platform, the news feed, articles pop up. It's hard to imagine them not seeing something related to this topic. And I think, one thing we've been thinking a little bit about is that this is, I think, upsetting for a lot of people and distressing and anxiety provoking. And the idea of having these conversations with your kids can feel awkward and anxiety provoking, and sometimes there's a tendency or an urge when we're experiencing that to just ignore it and kind of hope that it goes away. And one thing that we find it helpful to do is to think about, in situations like this, what do we have control over? One of the things that makes us think about is we have control over what we teach our kids, and how to educate them from an early age about some of these areas. So we really want to be able to talk about helping you with strategies for talking to your kids about these topics, while also thinking about how do you manage, again, sort of the frequency of this exposure, and especially thinking about developmentally inappropriate sort of content or images for certain age groups in home. So some strategies for managing exposure to media content. So this may seem obvious to some people, but of course, the younger the children, the less exposure they should have. I think we go as far as to say, for preschool and kindergarten age kids, we don't want them to have really any exposure to some of this. We certainly may want them to be learning strategies from an early age, and we're going to talk about that, but we want that to come from you. Being mindful of leaving television or news articles up on computer screens, again, going back to what Christina said about this being everywhere, your kid grabs your tablet and there is this article, right? And, we want to just be thoughtful and mindful of where we're leaving up some of this information in the home.
Yep.
Another piece is trying to find out, where are they getting their information from? Are they getting it from their newsfeed, from friends, from TV? Where are they, from SNL, right? Where are they hearing about this information? And trying to look it up in terms of wanting to know what they're reading, what they're watching, and use some of that to open up discussion with them.
Yeah, I think this one is so important too, right? It's also being mindful of the conversations that you're having as adults, right? And I think that's important in all age groups, right? I can imagine a situation, you have a play date with your toddler children, and this is very much, as you said, part of the national conversation. You want to talk to the other parent about what's happening, and your 2.5-year-old is nearby, right? So just being mindful at every age. And I think can I make one small point here? It's both about, it's obviously the content, and I think the way in which we are talking about the content, our children are listening very carefully to, right? And so we want to be thinking about modeling there, especially with our older children and adolescents, right? What kind of language are we using to describe the events? How are we talking about the people who are coming forward, right? So we can be modeling, building a supportive culture around that as well.
Absolutely, and I think, just piggybacking on that, this idea of being mindful of your own reactions and thoughts about this topic when talking to your kids. I think one thing that comes up a lot is, how do we educate without scaring? And I think about this as being part of that, in terms of the way that you're coming to your kids and talking about it. Are you at your most angry, right? Or your most scared, right? And just thinking about that and being aware of your own emotional sort of response when engaging with your kids. And lastly, just thinking about, what's your general family plan around media exposure, right? So thinking about the idea of making sure you're taking a break from screens, right? Whether it's putting on a funny show that you can watch as a family, or, just redirecting to other things that are separate from screens. And for older kids and teens, making this a collaborative conversation, helping them to think about, as adults, right, we need a break from the intensity of some of this media, right? And so, being validating and acknowledging that this may be something that's hard for them too, and helping them to think about how can they learn to sort of take their own breaks in some of their media use. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about, how do we open up these conversations? So again, this can be a difficult topic to broach. I think especially people wonder, how do you talk about this with younger kids, all the way up to how much detail do we get into with older kids? So we're going to talk a little bit about doing this over the course of the age ranges.
Right, and I think the second part of that, keep it going over time, right, is I think we want to dispel the idea right off the bat that this is one conversation that you have with your kids. And I think that's where a lot of the anxiety comes in, right? I'm envisioning like being in the car with your parent, like, this is the moment that we're going to have this very serious conversation. And although the content in itself is very serious, I think the more that you can just weave this into the conversations you're already having. Look, we have a moment in time in which there is so much media coverage that there's so many opportunities. Well, I'm skipping ahead to the older kids, so jumping into talking about this. But starting with our youngest children, right, our toddlers, our young elementary age children, our recommendation is really to limit or avoid media exposure to these topics, right, topics related to sexual harassment. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to have conversations about boundaries, limits, so, right, we want to provide developmentally appropriate information about body safety. And so what that means is teaching your children anatomically correct names of body parts, right? And I think, there's a lot of, people, so even from when they're 2, when you're giving them a bath, right, you want to, again, help them learn the names of their body, right? I think that that's useful across your life, but especially when we're thinking about this topic, right? You want your child to be able to communicate to you and others if something has happened, if there's a problem. You want to be talking a lot about how there's some body parts that are private, as well as then talking about situations in which that's not true, right? So when you take your kid to the pediatrician, but then you can talk about that, that the parent or caregiver would stay in the room. You also want to teach your child to come to you if they have questions about any of their body parts, or if any of their body parts are hurting. I think that's a good thing for safety overall. Absolutely. For these next 2, of giving your child permission to say no, right? I think when we're socializing our toddlers and young children, we spend a lot of time telling them that they need to respect adults, they need to follow directions from adults. And so this maybe a novel idea, right? So it can be things like grandma is coming over for Thanksgiving dinner and your child doesn't want to give grandma a hug, right? How does your child say no? Is that something that's respected within the family, right? You can model that on, again, a more daily basis, right? As you're giving your child a bath, I'm going to wash your face now. Can I wash your face, right? You want to be dialoguing all the time about this so that they start to understand that people should be asking permission before touching them and before they touch others, right? You want to be talking to your toddler about keeping their body safe and private, and so that also means not respecting others' personal space, right? We need to be thinking about both sides of this.
And you can give, have them think about examples, right? You're on the playground and you're chasing another kid and they're saying, no, stop, right? Helping them to learn that I actually do have to stop and listen and respect what that other person is saying. And I think similarly at home, respecting then when your child does say no, right? So
stop tickling
me.
If
they're saying, no, stop tickling me, right? To actually stop and respect that, right? Because we want to show them that when they do say no, it's heard and it's listened to.
Yep. And you want to establish a family culture about not having secrets, right? That there's nothing that your child can't come to you with. And I think this gets at this idea of how can we protect our children from this happening to them, right? And so there's research to show, right, that if a child is being harassed, assaulted, abused, right, can be discussion by the predator about, like, keep this a secret, right? So you want to establish that in your family, that there is no secrets for your children to you.
And that even if it's something that they, or someone that and and care about, if anything were to happen to them, right, that they will not get in trouble. There's nothing that they can't tell you that, that would get them in some sort of trouble with you.
Right. And exactly this idea, right? Reassure them that they will not get in trouble. Because again, I think that's a very common worry for that age group. If I tell my parents or caregiver that they're going to be very angry with me.
Take away my toys, that kind of
Right.
thing.
Yeah. All right. Should we talk about our older kids a little bit? So for our older elementary and middle school age children, right, you want to limit media exposure, right? I think it's fair to assume that children in this age group are going to have at least some information about what's been happening or what's being covered in the media.
We recognize this is a wide range, right?
Sure.
So thinking about, 4th and 5th graders up through 8th graders is going to be a pretty big difference. And I think within that, part of what we want you to be thinking about is that sort of the developmental age, right? Not necessarily the chronological age of your child specifically, because that may also differ in terms of how much information and where you go with this conversation.
Right, and this is so child specific, right? At the end of the day, you know your child better than anyone, right? So we want to give you some general ideas that you're going to tailor then to your child's needs. So you want to check in with your child about what they've heard from school or friends or what they've seen online, and you want to just think about, how can I ask it in an open-ended way instead of, have you seen the news? Well, that's a yes or no, and they've actually answered your question, right? You want to be very curious about their thoughts about it, because kids in this age group, they're highly likely to have a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding, so you want to take this opportunity to correct those. And I think, again, listen to how they're describing the event. And I think it's not just about factual misinformation. This is another opportunity to start to shape how they're going to think about all of this, right? Again, well, I guess we can get into that a little bit.
I was going to say along the same line, sometimes when there's a lack of information, kids have a tendency to fill in those gaps,
Sure.
with all sorts of things. And so being mindful of where there may be those pieces of information missing, where you can be filling in the gaps with accurate information.
And certainly as you're having these conversations, you want to be talking about consent. And you want to be talking about both how physical actions as well as words can be very hurtful. And then you want to start to talk about how to seek help if there's something that made them uncomfortable, that they're worried about, recognizing there's a broad spectrum of things.
Absolutely. And I know, again, parents worry and caregivers worry about not wanting to scare kids, right, about this happening. But I think part of what helps kids to feel more in control is to help them thinking about, if this were to happen, this is who I would go to, right? Like, this is who I have at school, this is who I have at home, this is who I can call, and helping them to feel prepared in some way.
And I think, we all have safety conversations with our kids, right? What happens when you get lost, or what happens if X, Y, and Z happen. So this just becomes part of that also. And I think to that final point about helping your child identify trusted adults, this also means that us as parents and caregivers have to be knowledgeable about the different environments that our kids are in, right? It's getting to know your kid's school, getting to know who's on guidance, being familiar with the handbook, you know, all that stuff. So then you can help them come up with who are appropriate people in their lives to approach with questions. So for our teenagers and young adults, you know, we encourage you, as Randy was saying earlier, to try to either watch or read the news or, you know, whatever media with your teen, or if you're not doing it with them, to figure out what, you know, what sources of information they have, and to really help them find reliable and accurate information, right? And you know, I think that's an important point. There's a lot of things out there, but it's how can you help them sift through it? As you were saying, you know, this is in the news every day, right? So it's a jumping off point for conversations. You want to really listen to what your child has to say. You want to invite questions. You want to ask their opinions. Again, they're at an age or a developmental time in which their thinking about things can be shaped and molded. So you really want to hear their thoughts, perspectives, values, and, you know, push them in the right direction.
And it also, I think, you know, when you're asking, what do you think about this? You know, I've noticed, you know, I saw you watching such and such or reading this, wondering what your opinion is. What do you think about that? Are you and your friends talking about that? I think it also shows them that you respect their opinion and you really want to understand, which then hopefully, ideally, leaves them more open to hearing your opinion and your information, and it can become more conversational and less lectury.
And check in how they're feeling. I can't believe we don't have this up there. As psychologists, we notice something about emotions, right? Right. You know, are they worried? Is it making them anxious? All those things.
I think along those lines, and along those lines, I think, you know, again, coming back to this, you know, how do we balance both the emotional part that we're potentially feeling and they might be feeling, but also giving them the tools to feel confident, right? And so it's acknowledging this is a really upsetting, right, and scary thing, right, to sort of like have all of these stories coming out, right, to imagine this being, right, sort of something that is so common, right, and sort of acknowledging and validating that is upsetting, right, and that is scary, and also, right, these are some of the things you and I can be thinking about together, right, to help you to feel safer, to help you to feel like you are prepared, right, if something were to happen.
And I think it's helpful to also be talking with your teen about if it were to happen to a friend, right? You know, they're often more receptive if it's not about you directly, my child is a teen, you know, your best friend or whatever.
And help them to feel empowered. Like if something were to happen to a friend, I would do something.
This is, you know, this is what I would do. This is who I would go to. And again, ongoing conversations about consent. I think that's super important, right? Thinking about the different, there are many different iterations of situations in which that would come up. So you want to help them think through that. And I think we touched on the last point. We can get into more specifics about identifying ways for your teen to seek help.
Absolutely. And again, you know, the idea of it being for a friend or for them, but helping them to think about who they could go to either way. Because I think that sometimes there can be anxiety about telling when it's a friend or something like that, but helping them to sort of anticipate and think through some of these situations before they happen, because that'll help them to feel more prepared going into any difficult situation.
Right, so seek help if needed, right? So if you're worried or concerned that something might have happened to your child or your child discloses something to you about themselves or a friend, you want to seek out appropriate resources and support to ensure their safety and get them help they might need. I recognize that that's not necessarily, you know, as specific as it could be, right? Because I think there's a lot of variance in what the situation might be, and we're happy to answer specific questions, but we do have some resources that we wanted to highlight. I think RAIN is such a great organization. I think they have both a lot of helpful, maybe more general information, as well as various hotlines that you can call. I think we want to be also thinking about, if you're, as you mentioned at the beginning, right, if your child has a history of trauma or another mental health condition, it might be helpful to, you know, touch base with your child's healthcare and mental health provider. Absolutely. Can we turn?
Now we're going to take some questions.
Okay. So question 1. How do you reconcile the lessons of being able to say no and showing respect for their no with parenting? Great. An example would be in asking your child if you can wash their face. When they respond, no, do not wash their face. Great. So again, it's a little specific based on your child, right? And I think, as I reach for my water here, then I think the question is, great, so are you going to wash your face, right, like you child? I think, look, there's obviously limits. I want to be clear that we're not suggesting that we're just handing over all the control to the toddler, right? But we want to be, maybe that night, no, skip it. I think.
Right. And I think coming back to your point, right, when it comes to something like that, you might give them, you can wash it or I can wash it, right? Yeah. So the washing is going to happen, but you're giving them some control over who's going to do it. Do you want daddy to do it or I to do it or whatever, that kind of thing. But I think it's always going to be, like Christina said, a balance, right? We recognize that you're not, one thing we teach parents is how to give really clear, direct commands, right? And so we're not saying to stop doing that. It's just a matter of being aware of, this other piece of things, because it's not necessarily one that comes, I think, as intuitive in some ways.
Yeah. Question 2, with teen boys, how do we teach them to be appropriate but still allow the excitement of leaning in for a kiss? I think that's a great question, and I think I want to be mindful of the first part of it with teen boys. I think it's really with teenagers, right? I think these are conversations that we need to be having with every child, right?
All genders.
Yes. How do we teach them to be appropriate? So, again, I think that this is situationally dependent, right? I think we could imagine a situation in which there are 2 teenagers that know each other very well, started to date, right? So you can imagine in that situation, right, that it would be all right to then lean in for a kiss versus if, one of the teens is intoxicated, right? So this is where those ongoing conversations about consent come in, right? Certainly it's important with consent, right, that it's explicit, and the idea of consent is quite simple, but the ways in the situations can be complex, right, which is why we need to be going through these different iterations.
Absolutely. And I think, talking about the idea that I think for teens, these topics are awkward, right? Awkward to have with each other, awkward to have with you. I think trying to reduce some of the awkwardness around it, letting them know it's okay to talk to the person you're interested about this, right? And that's actually a good thing, right? To have these conversations so that that both partners, right, that both people involved are thinking the same thing and are on the same page.
Yeah, and I think that we're encouraging our teens to have these conversations. I think there again, when you're having a conversation with a child of any age, right, we want to be modeling examples, right? And I can already imagine with the child being like, okay, cool, mom, thanks for that. But we want to at least give them some scripts of jumping off points, right? Yeah. And we want to, I want us to make the point that for younger kids, right, we want to role play, for example, like a neighbor comes to ask them if they want a cookie, and maybe whatever it is, like making examples and then have them practice saying, no, I actually have to go home, whatever it might be, because in the moment, if the situation, it's easier to, if you have practiced a response, you have an idea of how to get out,
absolutely,
that's useful. So question 3. Maybe I'll let you talk first. How would you apply this to children with special needs who may have difficulty understanding concepts and current events with 100% accuracy?
That's a great question. Yeah. I think, again, I come back to developmental level a bit, and that, special needs can mean a wide range of things, but I think in general, we want to be thinking about the developmental level, not necessarily the chronological age of the child in terms of how they interpret information, how much you think they're capable of knowing, if their thinking tends to be really concrete or really black and white. Some general things we think about with kids with special needs are providing sometimes images to go along with verbal content, visuals, things like that can be helpful.
Right, and I think we've talked about this a lot, right, is I think sometimes we have a tendency to okay, so these are the 5 things I want to impress upon my child, right? I think it's helpful to first check in with your child, right, and get a sense of what they've heard or what they're asking and being really clear on that so we don't provide too much information, right? Like maybe they're actually asking about something totally different than what we thought, so I think that's a helpful starting point, and then you can tailor your responses based on that.
Absolutely.
So, question 4. My daughter says, I'm tough. That would never happen to me. How can I explain it can happen to anyone without scaring her? I think that question gets at a lot of different things. And I want to, how can I explain it can happen to anyone without scaring her? And I think that's what we're talking about, the balance of like, these are really frightening, they can be really frightening topics, and we want to be having these conversations because we want to model to our children that even though this may be a frightening, upsetting topic, we are able to tolerate that and have these conversations with you. And I think also inherent in that is, I think there's some assumptions in that. I'm tough, that would never happen to me. And again, I don't know how old the daughter in this example is, but we really want to think about, does that mean that for people who are assaulted, harassed, that they're not tough, right? And it's a layered thing, but these are really important things that our kids are grappling with, and that I was going to pass this over here. And do you have anything to add on that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly you can be empowering her, right? And sort of like, yeah, you're right, you are tough, right? And we don't have control over other people all the time.
Right.
There are times where giving statistics is appropriate. Again, that's going to depend on your child and her age. We're not necessarily, saying you want to scare her with statistics, but sometimes just helping kids to understand that unfortunately this is more common than we'd all like it to be. And and you are right, you are tough, and you're brave, and there's still time, and we still want to empower you with some of these tools. So if you were ever in a position that made you get that feeling in your stomach that said this isn't right, I'm uncomfortable, you know what to do.
And although this wasn't actually part of the question, but I did want to bring up the point is we actually often get questions of how can I talk to my daughter? I'm worried about daughter. And statistically, that is correct, right? That women, girls are statistically much more likely to be assaulted or harassed. And we don't want to forget our sons, right? Or kids of any gender. So I feel like that's the idea that with every child, we want to be talking about this and thinking about this. So question 5, how can we as adults find out if kids have been victims to any kind of harassment? Again, great question. And I think our hope is as we start having these conversations with our kids when they're very young, that we are reminding them that they can come to us with anything, right? We hope that we're opening the door to open communication. I think I can totally appreciate the impulse to want to go and say, no, have you ever been sexually harassed or assaulted? And it is important to ask direct questions. We also find it can be helpful if you check in with your kid in more of a general way, right? I've been thinking, I wonder if there's things that make you uncomfortable at school.
How are people at school treating you?
Right, you're more
like adults and kids, that kind of thing.
Right, because again, thinking about the word harassment, right? If I'm talking to my 7-year-old, they might look at me like, Mom, I don't know what you're talking about, right?
Are people treating you kindly? Has anyone ever been mean to you? Has anyone ever done anything that made you feel uncomfortable? That kind of thing. And then I think, again, coming back to that reassurance, again, if you're using some of what's going on in the media as a jumping off point, like, I just want to remind you, and I know I've said this before, there is nothing that you could ever tell me that would make me change the way I think about you, change the way I feel about you, that would get you in trouble. Like, I just want to make sure you know that I'm here, and I will take the steps that we need to make sure you're okay.
And maybe we can talk about that for half a second here, about like what steps might you take. And if your child does tell you that something's happened to either themselves or a friend, there's a lot of different things that we want to think about. I think the first is you want to really listen to what your child's telling you. And it's difficult for me to imagine that as a parent, right, one can imagine immediate feelings of maybe rage, sadness, feeling very out of control. And to the extent possible, you want to check in with yourself, listen to what they're saying. You really want to reinforce to your child how glad you are that they came to you, how much you love them, and that you're going to figure it out together. And then depending on the situation, right, you would be thinking about, either contacting like a healthcare provider who can help.
Nutrition.
Yep, whether if you're connected to a therapist or a school counselor, and figuring out, you know, what steps both logistically need to happen, as well as being able to provide emotional support to your child. And I was going to say, and yourself as a parent, right?
And I think, you know, along those lines, you know, one thing we do know is research shows, you know, that the way parents or caregivers respond to a child's disclosure actually can play a big role in their outcomes in terms of how they do following something like a sexual assault. And I think another piece I'll just mention in terms of, you know, regardless of your sort of next steps, and again, it's going to depend in part on the age of the child, how much, but making sure that you are continuing the conversation, almost collaboration with your child or teen, you know, that we don't want them to feel like you are running off and doing, you know, different things related to this that they don't know about. So we want them to be, to a degree, you know, certainly aware of what these steps are, and that that's an ongoing conversation also. So on behalf of the Child Study Center, we want to thank you for joining us today. Once you leave this webinar, you'll receive a survey, and we'd appreciate if you would complete it. You'll also receive a follow-up email within a day or two with a link to a recording of today's presentation. We also really hope that you can join us for our next webinar, Playdate Bootcamp for Anxious Kids and Their Parents, with Rochelle Thies, and that's on Tuesday, January 16th at 1 p.m. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Bye.